Hi everyone, just double checking you can see us.
If you can just let us know in the questions section if you can hear us. We haven't started yet. We'll start in about 4 minutes time.
Thanks Susan. Can you see us as well? Yes, amazing.
Perfect.
Great.
It's great to have so many people from all around Australia. We've got people from Adelaide, Sydney, Queensland, Lake Macquarie, and Gorey.
Which we had to look up on Google Maps.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Let me just double check that it is recording.
Yeah.
It is recording. Great. Okay, we're going to get started.
Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here, and we have lots of people from all around Australia, which is fantastic. I'm Rebecca from Class Covers Relief Teacher Association.
And I'm Owen from the Australian Computing Academy at the University of Sydney.
And tonight, as you know, we are having a Digital Technologies webinar. This is the first in a 2-part series. Would you like to tell everybody what we're going to be addressing tonight?
Yeah, so we'll be covering sort of like what generally the Digital Technologies curriculum is, what it's all about, why it's important, and sort of breaking it down to the 10 key ideas that are inside the Digital Technologies curriculum, and we're going to be covering 2 of those ideas in much greater detail, which is looking at abstraction and data representation. I'll get into the nitty-gritty in a little bit.
Okay, and I think probably a lot of you guys out there, like me as a teacher, finds this topic to be kind of something that's exciting but extremely kind of nerve-wracking as well. So I, for one, am very grateful to have you here, Owen, because I feel like you're going to help me quite a lot with it. We also just want to let all of our teachers know that you can feel free to ask a question at any stage. There is a question tab on the right side of your screen, which we know that lots of teachers have already been using. So feel free to enter a question at any stage. We're going to keep our eyes peeled for some interesting questions or questions that we think obviously we'd like to help you answer. And we are going to have a Q&A at the very end of the webinar. So the plan is that Owen's going to take us through quite a lot of information, and then we'll come back to your questions later on.
Yep. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Just double checking, if I leave it like this, you can see my slide deck as well as us. Is that the case? I should have asked that beforehand, but you know, doing stuff live is always fun.
That's right.
If anyone could let us know in the chat or in the,
Okay,
good,
thanks,
perfect.
Melanie.
Thank you, Melanie.
Thanks a lot.
All right, let's get going. So just before I get started, the URL down the bottom is a link to the live slide deck that I'm going to be presenting on. You can download it as a PDF or just look at it if you like. So you'll see a bunch of anonymous people in there and myself, hopefully, but all of the slides and all of the information that I'll present is already available to you. Okay, so let's get going. So digital technologies as a subject is sort of basically kind of like the computer science, but it adds a bit more in terms of just computing as a discipline, but also the impact of computing on the world. And so it's broken down into these 10 key ideas. And everything in the digital technologies curriculum is based on these 10 key concepts that we call them. Abstraction, which looks at hiding details or information to only focus on a manageable number of things at once. Computers and technology and devices deal with lots of data, so we deal with the collection of that data, how we represent that data in our systems and how we've always represented data, and then finally how we can interpret that data to actually make sense of it. The next 3 are the specification of a problem, an algorithm, which is a sequence of steps in order to solve that problem, and then finally the implementation of that algorithm in code. The digital systems, this is like the devices that we use, and currently a digital system is defined as a device that can process information in binary. And these last 2 are a bit more of a synthetic concepts, which are how humans interact with technology and how humans use technology as a medium to interact with each other. And then finally, the impact of technology on the wider world. And as we all know, technology hasn't really impacted our lives very much in the last 20-odd years. These 10 key ideas were ideas that were true when computing just started in the 1940s and 30s and earlier. And these ideas are going to continue to be true in a world of super fast computing in the future. So by focusing on the key ideas that underpin all technology, the digital technologies curriculum will be be adaptable to any type of technology changes in the future, because we actually don't know what the future is going to hold. And so that is good from a standpoint of it's focusing on the fundamental ideas and can adapt to changes in technology as they occur. But the downside of this is that the language can sometimes be a little bit confusing, and the curriculum makes no compromises actually in using the technical terminology for everything. So, and
I think on that note, it's I think that's what makes teachers quite nervous.
Yeah.
Is if there's a lot of sort of jargon or, I don't know, just words that kind of throw you off, and if you feel, oh gosh, I don't really know what specification or algorithm.
Yeah, and so if there's any words that you don't understand, then feel free to ask. This webinar is going to focus on these two that are highlighted, the abstraction and the data representation. And the next one will cover algorithms and implementation. So you might think that this is about coding and programming. I'll just note that coding is only one idea in this 10 key ideas. So it's only one part of this whole broader discipline, which is computing. Okay, so I'm going to be referring to the national curriculum because we're talking to everyone from all different states. So that you can map with the ACA IDs to each jurisdiction's ID because it's a bit difficult to do a mapping to 8 different jurisdictions at once. So if you look at the ACA curriculum, this is where those key ideas are actually represented in the curriculum itself. And this is what the curriculum actually looks like. I strongly recommend looking at it in this view because it shows the progression of an idea as it goes from foundation or in kindergarten or prep or pre-primary or whichever state that you're in calls it, from the start of school right to the end. So you can see the idea progresses in complexity, but the thing to remember is that the fundamental ideas actually remain the same throughout. They just build in sophistication and add more things to it. But the concepts themselves are actually hopefully easy to grasp once you get your head around it.
That's actually quite.
Yeah, and so we'll come through this deep dive into the curriculum in a little bit, but this view gives you a good view to see the progression of each of those ideas. And you'll notice that there's not that many dot points in the curriculum because that's how the ACA sort of put those constraints on it. So writing a curriculum involves taking all of this discipline of computer science and putting it into about 12 dot points in a particular level. And so that means that teaching a curriculum means figuring out what the hell the curriculum writers were trying to think. And that's hopefully what I'll try and do throughout the rest to explain to you in some hopefully plain English and understandable English. That would be great. But before I get into that, digital technologies is often sort of confused a little bit with the general ICT capability. In a nutshell, general digital technologies is about how devices are created and using a computer as a tool to do your bidding and about solving problems. The ICT capability is confidence in using devices generally. So being able to save files, send emails, navigate devices, share files and stuff like that. There is a lot of overlap, but the ICT capability is just the use of technology. Digital technologies is more about the creation of technology and underpinning ideas that underlie that. So the ICT capability is actually the responsibility of every teacher, not the digital technologies teacher. So it's something that you should definitely, I mean, as relief teachers, I'm not sure how much interaction you have in staff rooms and things like that, but it's important to understand that at least. So it's, I guess, easy parallel is English is much deeper than literacy, but the ability to read and write has a sort of natural home in the English curriculum. Also, mathematics is much deeper than just knowing the number system and how to add, but numeracy has its natural home in mathematics. Similarly, computing has its natural home in digital technologies, but it's not exactly the same thing. It's skills, yeah, it's skills that should be used and developed in all disciplines because we use computers for lots and lots of different things. It does have its natural home there, but it's not only part of that. You use numeracy in all learning areas, and you can't really do much without fluency in English. And so digital technologies is very much an intellectual discipline where ICT capability is more about just using technology with confidence. So I'll burn through these quite quickly, but these are some of the dot points of things that are covered by ICT capability, like typing, word processing, doing presentations, emailing, and stuff like that. And digital technologies goes much deeper into the fundamental ideas that underlie computing. And these are some great posters from the DT Hub, and we'll cover that a bit later. Okay, with that out of the way, we're going to start talking about our first key idea, which is data representation, which describes how data is represented and structured symbolically for storage and communication by people and in systems. So it's how we represent information. And as humans, we've been representing information since the beginning of language, and we'll go through how that sort of evolved. But one side note, the curriculum writers, when they put this in, put data are, and it just sounds a bit weird as a plural. So we crossed it out and added this is. I think
you guys did that?
We did that. It's a bit of an analogy for life. When you put things to bureaucrats in Canberra, they bug it up. And so we had to fix it for them. But the most important word here is by people. We store information and we use information for a purpose, and that purpose is to communicate and explore ideas. And it's really much about how people use it, and how we use it in digital system is just a continuous sort of the next step in that evolution. And so we're going to cover from foundation to year 2 about what's covered in this idea of data representation, which is recognizing, exploring, and representing data. This emoji didn't render properly on this keyboard, on this computer, unfortunately. So we're going to do an activity now. Could you all go to this URL? If you've got the slides open, you can click on it. And it's going to take us all to a communal interactive whiteboard. I've never actually used this. So if you can go to the whiteboard, it'll load up and look like this. If you load this URL, and the URL, I'll leave it here, is cmp.ac/whiteboard. I want some of you to draw a pig in the whiteboard, and I want others to draw a dog. You can't label your pig or your dog in any way. No writings of the word oink or woof or anything like that. I want you to draw a pig or a dog, and then we'll discuss what this relates to digital technologies.
Oh, these are so good.
All right, I'm seeing a little.
That's a good one. I think I can guess that one though.
I think we can guess that one. All right, we're drawing on top of each other. It's great.
There's a little bit of Mr. Squirrel. Looks really good.
Okay, this looks like a bit of a cat or a mouse. I'm not sure if it's a pig or a dog.
Same with this one. On the left.
Okay, this one down here on the bottom, bottom left is definitely a dog.
I think those ears are a giveaway, yeah.
This one at the top, this one's good. This is definitely a pig.
That's a good way. Someone's drawn a cat.
Okay, that's amazing. I'm gonna start discussing it, but I'm gonna come back to that just for my own amusement. I think.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, guys.
That's amazing. So what were the features of our pigs? We can open the. Can I open the chat here? Actually, what were some of the features of our pigs here?
So if you guys want to submit some of those.
I think they should be able to talk in the chat. If they can't, they can add questions.
Oh, good. Yeah, we've got some. Good one, Evelyn.
The URL hopefully it's in the slides. It's cmp.ac/whiteboard. It doesn't matter if
Curly
you're
tail.
curly tail. And
Everyone, you're taking this one home.
yeah. So the snout and the curly tail are the features of our pigs. What about our dogs? Looking for, oh my God.
No, not the next one.
Not the next one.
I think, for example, whoever drew the dog on the bottom left-hand corner sort of nailed it.
Yeah. Okay. They certainly did. So some of the features of our dog is the snout and the curly tail. And primary teachers, there's no real lesson in primary school that says pigs have curly tails. In fact, some pigs actually don't have curly tails, but this is a convention that we use. And by using this convention we've just gathered it through growing up and living in society, we can just represent this idea of a pig just with a curly tail. And that actually makes communication possible and easier.
I guess it's the same with just them saying oink.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't actually say oink.
And we'll get to oink in a minute.
Yeah.
And so as long as we agree on these conventions, we can communicate this idea of a pig really easily just by drawing a snout and a curly tail, and we can make that communication much more efficient. And so we've represented a pig just by compacting it and focusing on the things that are actually relevant. Similarly with the dogs might be a bit harder, but the floppy ears, for example, and the shaggy tail or something like that is a really strong representation of a dog. And so this is an activity that you can do with young kids, or even you can put some constraints on it for later kids, and we can talk about that in a minute. But signage is a good example of representation. And so this is actually at Perth Airport. And you could think it might be no dogs or no Trojan horses. It's quite blocky. And signage is trying to represent an idea without relying too much on those cultural contexts, because they want to work for people of all different cultures. This one might be a slightly better representation. It's got the collar, it's got a bit blocky, but it's still a simple idea. What about this one? This one might be when I'm driving down the road and I see a flying pterodactyl, try not to wheel into the giant on a bicycle next to me.
That is strange.
And so what this is actually trying to communicate is skydivers in the area.
Oh,
it's actually near.
I definitely wouldn't have made that connection.
Yeah. It's near Maruya Airport, and so a better representation of skydivers might be parachutes. Right?
Yeah.
And this is as a problem that actually has too much information. We're on a road. We know that there are cars on the road already. And why is there a giant on a bicycle? I'm not quite sure.
Just also, for me, it's incredibly morbid, even though that's what the image is supposed to represent.
Yeah. And so this really gets to the purpose of representing information. Is really to communicate ideas. And so that's really the main reasons of representing something, is communicating. It can be used in thought and creating knowledge, and then when we can start to write the knowledge down, we can manipulate and perform calculations on that knowledge. And also we can store information through its representations, through cross distances, and also through time as well. So say we wanted to hunt or trade a pig. What could we do? Before language was invented, this could involve pointing at an actual pig, and you have to bring it along to the market. But this is only limited to things you can see in front of you. And so it's much more convenient to find a way to represent that pig or that thing that you're trying to sell without actually bringing it all there. It might be a bit inconvenient to haul 40 pigs along to the market when you're... And trade was one of the drivers of communication and representing information. So what we could do is have a part of a pig, for example. You might bring a skull. In modern times, we might want to think about chopping off a tail and bringing that along, but that also might get a bit smelly after a little while. And so a better idea might be to have some kind of painting or to carve it into a rock or something. And so we can represent this idea of a pig and use that before even language is invented. Eventually, we created sounds to represent these ideas, and those sounds turned into language. And then eventually that language turned into symbols again, and we have our modern writing symbol. It's a system is we're representing words as different symbols. So this is how long we've been representing information. This is a cave in Sulawesi in Indonesia, and here's a bit more of an artist rendition. This is a bush about 35,500 years BC, so 37,000 years ago. And we can see by comparing against the whiteboard and these pigs that art education really hasn't improved that much in the last 35,000 years. But we've been representing information to tell stories and convey ideas for as long as, like, longer than we can remember, well before our language was invented. And so this gets to the idea of, like, I'm going to tie the other key concept, abstraction, to this idea of data representation.
Just if we're going further, just a question. So with all of this, are you saying that for this particular example with representation, we don't necessarily always have to, when we're linking it to digital technologies, it doesn't necessarily have to be...
No, it's more fundamental than just getting a computer. It's actually using something that represents something else as an idea. And as you move through the school system, then that links to computing. And I'll get to that when we get to the later year levels. But it's actually when in primary school and kindergarten or foundation to year 2, it's actually using something to represent something else. And that's really the idea that we're getting. So I'll tie that idea to abstraction, which involves hiding the details of an idea, problem, or solution that are not relevant to focus on a manageable number of aspects. And it's a natural part of communication. We rarely communicate every detail because some details are just not relevant. So, for example, if you were hanging out in your staff room at morning tea and you asked your colleague, how did you get here today? And they said, well, at 6 a.m. my alarm went off. I rolled over, put one foot on the floor, put the other foot on the floor, stood up, turned left 90 degrees, walked forward 5 paces, and continued with that level of detail until they were sitting next to you. Yeah, recess would be over and you would not speak to that person ever again. And so we naturally abstract away the irrelevant details because we all get up and get to work. A good answer might be, I took the bus, or I rode my bike, or something like that, where we've hidden away all the details that are not relevant and just focused on the key idea that is relevant. Another example might be that someone asks, how are you? And depending on how well you know them, even if you don't know them very well, even if a limb's just been fallen off, you're still going to say, I'm good. But if you know someone very well, that's an invitation to go on some kind of Shakespearean monologue into how crappy the date's going. And so given the context, the level of detail, we can adapt that, and we do that naturally. And so abstraction, and lots of these ideas in digital technologies are things that we already do. We're just applying a bit of technical terminology and then looking at how that is actually applied in our computing systems. So taking it back to our pigs, here's a pig in 2019, 80s. We can see it's got our features. We've got the snouts, we've got the curly tail, and it's pink. Here's the Angry Birds pig. So there's no tail, there's no body. So we can, but it's still a pig, and it's still very recognizable as a pig. And we can represent that idea just with the snout and a bit of a face and maybe some rounder ears or something like that. And still recognizable even if you've never been taught. And so we've hidden away all the details that are not relevant, and we only focus on the things that actually communicate that idea. Okay, and so in years 3 and 4, we're looking at how the same data can be represented in different ways. So humans developed language. It wasn't bequeathed to us by the language gods. It's been evolved over time. And it's a convention of sequence of arbitrary sounds to convey meaning. And so in English, we agree to use the pig and g as the sounds that communicate this idea of a pig. That's just a convention. As long as we agree on that convention, then that makes communication possible. But there's other conventions, and if your English teacher say that there is another type of convention that represents sounds, which is onomatopoeia, which is our oink. But it turns out we don't even agree on that. So in English, it's oink, oink. In Dutch, it's knorr, knorr. In German, it's kunz, kunz. In Polish, it's kui, kui, which sounds quite cute. And for our projects, we partner with a company called Grok Learning that run the platform for our programming exercises. In Indonesian, it's called Grok Grok.
Actually, I have a Japanese friend, and she's told me that in Japan.
Boo boo.
Yeah, she say boo boo.
Exactly. And so onomatopoeia is also just a convention, and by agreeing on that convention, then we can still use that representation of a pig sound or any animal sound.
Super interesting.
And this is a really good activity to do, particularly if you've got Indigenous students in your classes, to ask them how to Indigenous language, how do we represent what different animals sound like, and compare that with the English representation. It's a really good example to involve other cultures as well. So it turns out spelling is also an abstraction. So it's often common to over-regularize our verbs. So we take something like as a walk and we apply a rule as a common rule to make it past tense. So for example, walk might go to walked, speaks might go to speaked, talk might go to talked, run might go to run.
Putted.
Yeah, putted. And if kids actually do that, they're really making a really large cognitive leap, which is taking a convention, taking a rule system, and then applying it to new areas. And that's exactly what we want to encourage kids to do. Unfortunately, English is a bit dumb sometimes, and we've got all of these edge conditions that it's actually smart, but it's actually not like that this time because of history. And so we have, and it's all just, it doesn't really matter the rule, even though sometimes it might be a bit confusing to learn. But the important point is it's a convention. And as long as we agree on that convention, then that makes communication possible. And we don't have a choice on what that convention is, unless we start looking at the world of emoji, for example, and newer forms of communication where we can create our own new conventions. But English for the moment, we don't actually have a choice. So this takes us into numbers as well. So what if we wanted to trade several pigs, or counting several things? So it's separating the idea of the numberiness of something. So if we had 5 pigs, the fightiness from the thing that you're talking about, like 5 cuts, 5 pigs, 5 humans. So it's separating that idea of how we can count to and applying that same thing to all different types of things. And that's a quite large development. But before we had a number system, how would we represent those numbers? So when we start, we've got 10 fingers. So you might use the base 10, could lead to counting in that. If we go into higher numbers, we could start to use tallies. But the problem with tallies is once you go over a certain number, then you need to add more symbols and you need to put a cross it. So you have to count them from the beginning. And so that leads towards introducing more symbols. And finally, we get to our Hindu Arabic base 10 convention, which means the arrangement is significant. So the number 103 is 1 times 100 plus 0 times 10 plus 3 times 1. And the fact that we use just 10 is just also a convention. It doesn't actually matter how many symbols we use. We can use 10, we could use 16, we could use any number. It doesn't actually matter. Math still works. It's just a convention that we have applied to represent all numbers.
It's funny when you break something down like that.
Yeah.
You actually analyze something that you've just taken.
Taken for granted, and hopefully none of this is actually new. We all know how to count, and so it's actually applying that idea to think about how we represent that information. So in years 5 and 6, we looked at all data can be represented as whole numbers. So we're continuing this progression of adding a bit more complexity to this idea of representing something as something. So we're representing everything as numbers. A good example of that might be text. So each character is represented as a number, and that the standard that we use right now is called Unicode. It used to be called ASCII, but now Unicode is all of the languages of the world, including emoji. So Unicode is governed by the Unicode Consortium, which is a bunch of old white dudes in America, I think. And you can actually add new characters, new things to the Unicode standard. So for example, hijab emoji was just added, for example, and you can front up to the Unicode Consortium and plead your case to add a new emoji to our character set. So it's something this is actually continually evolving. Unfortunately, we're rejected, so all the Trekkie nerds out there, you can't type in Trekkie, unfortunately. But the important point is that all the characters are represented as a number. And so in Unicode and in ASCII, A is 97, B is 98. And does 97 sound fairly arbitrary? Yes, it definitely is. It doesn't actually matter what number we use, as long as we agree on that number, and that makes communication possible between our devices. So the word pig is represented as 112, 105, and 103. So literally, when you text a text message of the word pig to someone, your phone will convert that into these numbers, transmit those numbers over the wire to someone else's phone, and then it'll reinterpret those numbers into the letters P, I, and G. And that's how. Thank you. And that's fundamentally how text messaging works.
This stuff is just like so next level.
So here's an activity that you can do with this particular kind of idea. You can just download an ASCII table and you can write out a message, but then write out the message and then look up the number and then send those numbers across the room. And then give send the numbers across, and then someone else will have to decode the message and figure out what it says. And that's actually
be a really good relief teacher idea, actually.
Yes, this is why it's included.
Yeah, it's a good one, guys. Take it.
And so for extension kids, you wouldn't necessarily do this with a class that you didn't know. If you gave someone a jumbled table, then they wouldn't be able to decode the message. And it's important to emphasize that this agreement on this convention, it doesn't actually matter what numbers we use. As long as we agree, then we can enable communication to actually happen. So in Python programming, we can look up what that number is. So you're not expected to know this at this point, so don't worry. There's just a little thing that we can call to get the number for A, and it's 97. And then we convert a number back to a character, so 98 is B. This even works for emoji, so we always come back to our pigs. Which you're all wondering what the number for pig is, and I'm happy to tell you that's 128,022. And
we learn something new every day.
And so that's what an emoji, instead of sending the number 97, you actually send a much larger number because it was added a lot later. So there's lots and lots of different characters in this Unicode character set. And so the idea, again, that every character, everything in a computer is just represented as a number. There's another great activity through CS Unplugged, and for any digital technologies, Relief Teacher, particularly if you're just coming into a lesson, CS Unplugged is the best resource that you will find. It has these great activities that don't require a computer, just require some printing, and they'll explore all of these different ideas in digital technologies in an unplugged way. They're fantastic, and we'll go through some in a little bit. Okay, so moving into high school now, we look at some particular examples of representation in our computing system. So in years 5 and 6, we looked at how everything can be represented as numbers, and then in high school we look at some specific examples of that. So everything in computers, including text, images, and audios, and we also introduced the idea of binary representations in high school as well. So it's possible to represent any number in a binary number. And so because we can represent everything as a number, we can also represent that thing in a binary number. And computer scientists have taken sort of representation as an extreme sport. And instead of having 10 symbols, we can represent things using only 2 symbols, which is just a 0 and a 1, which is why it's called binary. And a typical computer might have, that has around 8 gigabytes of RAM in its working memory. It might have 64 billion zeros and ones. That's a lot of zeros and ones. And literally all we can do, because we only have these 2 symbols to work everything with, when things get more complicated and we add more graphics and more, we just throw more zeros and ones at the problem. And that's
Sounds good.
that's literally all we can do. So 2 digits is all you need to represent everything, and I'll reiterate, the key idea is we can represent everything as numbers, and those numbers can be represented in binary. And the reason for that is that is through physics actually. Circuits is much easier to store and manipulate just an on and off a high voltage and low voltage value, like a switch on or a switch off, and we use the switch on and the switch off to again represent the idea of a 0 or a 1. So it's like turning on and off a switch just means that it's a 0 or a 1, and that's our way of representing that symbol.
Is that actually a 0 and a 1 on the switch?
Well, on the switch is a 0 and a 1, and it's also what how on and how off.
Nice one. I didn't realize that.
There
There you go.
There you go.
I'm learning so much. Thanks, Owen.
A great activity for this is binary counting, which is count the dots. And so it has this idea of the cards. And so I think there is a YouTube video here, which, how much time have we got? Oh, we probably got time. It looks at, I actually won't watch the video now, but this Unplugged activity steps you through everything that you need to know to run this, and steps about.
We'll include the video in afterwards.
Yeah, and you all have the slide deck as well already. So if you want to watch that afterwards, if you want to learn a bit about how binary works, then please watch that. And so getting kids to understand what a binary number and converting a number from binary to a number in decimal is something that's expected in the year 7-8 band, so in high school. Primary kids can also certainly get it and understand it, but that in the curriculum, that's where it sits. The curriculum specifically mentions representing data in computers in text, images, and audio. So we've already looked at text, which is that A is 97 and emoji numbers can be represented as a different number, and that is the Unicode standard. It also works as images and audio as well. And the example of that is on the screen, our RGB color scheme. We represent a red, green, and blue color as a number for red, a number for green, and a number for blue. And the number goes from 0 to 255. And the reason that it's 0 from 255 is because that's the amount of combinations in just 256 combinations, which is the number of possible combinations in 1 byte or 8 bits of information. So each color fits into 1 byte. And so looking at the binary representation of a number, 0 to 255, gives us insight into why we use those colors, because the byte is the piece of information that is like a standard unit of setting everything sort of measured in bytes, and a color fits into 1 byte in our RGB color scheme. And so all of the colors on my laptop screen right now is a few billion, or a few million at least, different red, green, and blue, which tells each pixel what color that is. And you can actually calculate how many different numbers there are if you multiply 1080 by 1080p, I think it's 1080 by 1920 by 3, because each pixel is calculated. And so there's lots of numbers that make up a computer screen, and everything in a computer is just represented as numbers. You might start with looking at a black and white pixel being either a 0 or a 1. You can add grayscale, so 0 to 255 might be how bright that pixel is, and then you can use 3 colors. And all of these are just different ways of representing colors. You could, printers use a different color scheme, which is CMYK, and the C stands for cyan, the Y stands for yellow, and the M stands for magenta, and the K stands for black, because we can use black ink. And the reason that they're different is that red, green, and blue are additive color schemes, so the colors will add together to produce all of the colors. But in printing, when you put more and more colors on top of each other, it's actually subtractive color. So when you put more and more colors on, it gets closer and closer to black, as opposed to getting closer and closer to white.
I think teachers are familiar with that when it comes to
printing. Yeah, exactly. And so that's why primary colors on computers are different to the primary colors in painting, because computer colors add, and that's a function of how our eyes work, but I won't get into that much detail.
Yeah, heads are already capacity.
And so it also works for audio. So this is sort of a simple example of a sine wave, or what might look like an audio wave. And each dot is just a different number. And that's how we can represent an audio. So when you make a phone call to someone, there is a thing inside your phone that is just taking lots of these samples at each dot and then just converting that to a different number, and then putting some kind of compression on those numbers to make it into less numbers, sending it along, and then the other end of the phone is taking that stream of numbers and then putting it out your speaker. And that's how like a phone conversation at sort of that conceptual level actually works under the hood. So it's we represent all of our sounds as numbers as well, and we're just sending those numbers across, and that might be how a Skype call or something like that will actually work. Okay, so that's in year 7 and 8. Now we're moving into years 9 and 10, which talks about the compression of data and separating data apart. I'll give you some examples of that. So the first idea is compression, which by definition means representing the same thing, something with less information. So we use less data to represent the same thing. And a good analogy of that might be with our pig or dog activity. How can we draw a pig or a dog with 4 lines or 5 lines? And so we're representing that same idea, but using less ink or less lines. And so there's less detail. So we're actually compressing that image, but still communicating the same idea. And which features we choose, and that's how you can link it to abstraction. You might just draw the ears and a line for a dog, for example, and just a snout and a tail for a pig, and that might be how you represent those things with less information, but less lines, but still conveying the same idea. So we're actually compressing the information in that way. You can take it to a bit more of an extreme sport, get rid of the legs and just have the ears and the tail, and then a curly tail and a snout, for example.
Extremely curly.
There's another great activity that I would strongly encourage you to have a look at, which looks at this compression idea and also looks at representing an image, which is a run length encoding from CS Unplugged as well. And it also looks at representing each line just with a given number. So here's an example of how that might work. We're just representing this image that's colored in with these numbers here. And if we apply a rule, and if we follow that rule, then we can redraw the image just based on the numbers that are presented. And the rule is we always start with white. So that means if we have a 4 on the top line, we would have 4 white pixels, 3 black pixels, and then 3 black pixels again. And so we represent that image with that whole line with 3 numbers. And that's actually very similar to how fax machines used to work. And this is a good example of compression. We're compressing this whole image, each line in that image to just 3 different numbers. And by applying the rule, then we can just recreate the image again. And so There are certain ways where we don't compress. It actually takes us more information than the original image. If we had a checkerboard image example, there would be lots and lots of different different numbers. It would take more information, but there's lots of different ways of representing an image, and this is a good example to do an image representation as well as convey the idea of compression, which is communicating an image in smaller bits of information or fewer numbers. The curriculum also talks about structured representation, which is how do we represent an object or an entity in the world, and what type of information represent each attribute. So for example, to represent a student in your classroom, they might have what types of information do they might have a first name, they might have a last name, they might have an age, they might have a height, a gender, and these are information that you could put that convey that idea of a student, for example. And you only need the amounts of information for your particular purpose. It also talks about the types of information. So I'm not sure if any of you in Excel have typed in a mobile phone number before. And when you hit enter, it actually chops off the leading 0 by default. And because it treats a number as text. And because a phone number isn't really a number, it has numbers in it, but it might have some brackets, it might have a plus symbol. And so in Excel, there is actually a phone number type.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so you actually want to do different things to numbers than you want to do to text. You might want to add numbers, but it doesn't make much sense to add phone numbers together, right? And so it actually makes more sense to treat them as text or as like a phone number type than an actual number, even though it involves numbers. And so thinking about how we represent those things because of the way we want to store and manipulate. An example of a structured representation might require whole lots of information. So for example, we're sending a letter, we need an address, we need a street, a postcode, the country. You might want to back put who sent it, the contents, the stamp, the envelope, and these are all of the pieces of information that represent this thing, the idea of a letter. And so there's a certain structure that we follow in order to send information from one place to another. And the same is actually true of how we structure information to send over the internet. And so just like a letter, we have where it's going and then where it's coming from, and then this data is actually what's inside the letter or what piece of information that we're actually sending. And so in a computer network, it's just much like a letter where we have information about the data that we're sending, but also we have the actual data as well. And so this information is structured, and as long as we agree on which part is the source and which part is the actual data that we're sending, by following that convention, then we can actually send information from one place to another. So we also look at separating the content from the presentation. And this is the final idea, I promise, that we're covering in the curriculum. And that's the idea of separating how something looks by the content of what it is. And a simple example might be a Word document. So one way of writing a Word document might be if you have headings, you might have different paragraphs, you might have subheadings. And if you apply a type of heading instead of just changing the font size, then if you have 1,000 headings and you can just click update the style, all of your headings will magically update because they've been tagged as a heading, not as a paragraph, for example. And this is the same as how websites work. They'll have different headings and different elements. And we can change what those elements look like by applying a different style, but we keep the content the same. And so a PowerPoint document might be similar. We might have a different theme, and we can change how it all looks, but the content, the actual text, stays the same. And so that's that idea of separating the content from the presentation. So you might actually want to make a really long Word document, and someone's gone through the headings and just changed the font size of each one in a 1,000-page document. They might have a hard time changing how it looks.
Yeah, I've done.
And so the idea that we're conveying is we separate how it looks from the actual text. Here's an activity, if this is for year 9 and 10 content, so if you haven't done any web programming, then don't worry, you can stick with web, that's absolutely fine, because the idea is actually the important thing. But if you're interested, you can play with how different web pages it looks through this CSS Zen garden. I think in the comments on the slides, there's a few particular examples to look at too. You can experiment with how web pages convey this idea by changing the CSS, which is separated from the actual content or the structure of the document and the text. So this is the heading, this is the paragraph. And then using the CSS, which is how we manipulate that, we can change the color or change the font or change whatever aspect that we like. But the key idea is separating what it looks from the content. Yeah. Okay, that was a lot.
Should we?
So we'll have a bit of a recap. I really want to tie back to the curriculum and actually what it says, and then we'll go through some questions. So just to recap everything from foundation to year 2, we're looking at recognizing and exploring patterns in data and representing data as pictures, symbols, and diagrams. So this is a picture of a pig. This is a symbol that could be a pig. This is a diagram of something, and that's representing a piece of information. And in years 3 and 4, we build on that idea that there are different types of data and explore how the same data can be represented in different ways. It could be a drawing of a pig, a picture of a pig, a video of a pig, the word pig. And they're the same, different ways of representing the same information. You could ask kids to come up with different examples of that. You know, that way might be a tally of 4, the number 4, the word for, quattro in a different language, and there's different ways of representing the same thing, the same idea, which is 4. And finally, we look at, moving on to how in our computing we can represent anything as whole numbers. So all data in digital systems are represented as whole numbers, so we can represent text, we can represent images and audio, and we look at those specific examples in years 7 and 8. And then in years 9 and 10, which is an elective subject, we analyze compressing information and how the content is being is separated from the presentation.
Can I ask one then? Yeah. Because I don't know much about high schools and primary training. What happens in year 11 and 12?
That is up to the states. Okay. So there is no national version of digital technologies in year 11 and 12, and most of them are still using their old curriculum and they haven't updated their current jurisdiction to the new digital technologies. Okay. I think South Australia has a version. I'm not sure its phase of implementation right now, but for example, here in New South Wales, they don't have that updated year 11 and 12 curriculum. You should be aware that this last dot point actually is completely incomprehensible. And the reason is that ACA gave the curriculum authors a dot point budget, and so they could only have so many dot points that they could use, and whenever they had the ideas that they needed to convey, but there not enough dot points to convey them, they joined them by the word and so this is what we call a dodgy and. And so what this dot point should say in the curriculum is analyze simple compression of data, and you could do that with that one-length encoding activity, and then analyze how content data can be separated from its presentation.
Oh, okay.
So looking at Word documents, PowerPoint documents, or CSS, for example. Here, all of those content separated as an idea as it's introduced throughout the system. So you can really see the progression of an idea as we move through the school system. So if you're teaching, it's very good because not many students will have done this prerequisite stuff. So when you're teaching, knowing what's come before and knowing where you're going is actually really helpful. So this is the progression of this particular idea. And there's lots of opportunities to connect data representation with different learning areas. For example, maps are a good example of data representation and visualization. Mathematics, the number, place value. Data representation is maths and is not exactly the same thing. The maths curriculum was actually written before the digital technologies curriculum, and particularly in high school, data representation in maths is more about data like visualization, like drawing graphs and stuff, and they use the word data representation to convey that, but it's not exactly the same thing. In arts, looking at the color systems and the different color systems is a great way to connect digital technologies and art. And that whole history of English and pronunciation and vocabulary and conventions, a great way to connect it with English as well. So to summarize everything, we developed language and representation through history. It was pictures, languages, symbols, diagrams. We use whole numbers to represent everything in our digital systems, including specifically in Year 7 and 8. What we look at are text, images and audio examples. We only need 2 symbols to represent any number, which is our binary system. We teach abstraction and communication and solving problems, and we use abstraction all the time. You're using it in language every day. You're already doing lots of this stuff already. Now you can just apply it and tick it off the digital box for things that you're probably already doing or slightly adapting it. Mm-hmm. And so hopefully you can see on this that the concept of representing information is something that you might have known already. You might not have gone through how it's used in our computing systems later on, but we use something to represent something else already. And hopefully that's an idea that you understand already. And so digital technologies really provide sort of a deeper understanding of these ideas and how they're used to create all technology. This last point, I just wanted to show you this on our website, aca.edu.au/curriculum. We have a whole unpacking the curriculum section, which works in 2 directions. If you click on data representation, which is the one we've just covered, click on unpack. We've got the curriculum words up the top, but then we've provided a bit of an explainer of that, hopefully in plain English, and given a few examples of what students should be able to do to complete this particular top point. And you'll see when my mouse is overing, it highlights the relevant section of the curriculum. And if you're, say, a Year 3-4 teacher, you can click on the Year 3-4 band, and that has the whole 3-4 band in one page with a sort of explainer and hopefully in plain English of what the curriculum actually, its outcomes that are expected. And so all of this was written by the curriculum authors, Paula, James, Anna, and Bruce. And so we're still actually editing this, but that is something that's on our website that I would very much encourage you to go ahead and look at, because I know we covered everything in a very fast pace, and that is almost an hour, so I am going to cover your questions.
Yeah, let's get some questions up then.
Okay.
And guys, thanks so much. Well, firstly, Owen, thank you so much. I feel like I've learned so much with you in this hour. So we're just going to look through some of the questions.
I'm not seeing any of the slides. Oh. Is there a response to help me see the new slides?
Done it with Morse code and Braille. That's amazing.
Hopefully some of you could see the slide deck.
If you couldn't, I'm very sorry about that. People gave us the okay that it was good. All right, sign language is a fantastic example. So we had some questions that we were covering before, that we sort of came up with before. I'll start answering those while we
load some. Well, actually, I think as relief teachers here, one thing that obviously we're really interested in, and I think you've covered this quite well, is just what we can do in terms of the digital technologies curriculum in a relief teaching day. I think some of the examples you've given us are fantastic.
Yeah.
And would you recommend, like, all those things that you said, which would you think would be, like, perhaps the most easiest or require the less, the like, little, what's the...
I mean, it's really good to start from the idea of explicitly saying we're representing this thing as something else. So, for example, just doing the pig dog activity with your classes. And if they're a bit later, in later years, then you could draw the pig dog with your students, and then put these kind of constraints if they're in high school to say draw it in 4 lines now, 5 lines, and then talk explicitly about representing this thing as something else. Looking on the CS Unplugged website is a great way to do that. It's a really good resource. There's great activities that you could, particularly as a relief teacher, just come in and use, and that could be your lesson. It covers, for example, binary counting. There's stuff on networks. There's stuff on basically everything, actually, in computer science. If I go to CS Unplugged. And also in the slide deck, which hopefully you can see my screen. Is my screen still not visible now, or is it ended up following from the slides and saying it's my PDF? My screen is not visible. People can see my screen. Looks like a few people could not see the screen, which is very unfortunate. All right. Screen not visible. Is the screen visible now? You can only see the two of us. Yes. Yes. Okay. All right. I'm very sorry. I thought.
Yeah, we're sorry. The intention was not to have just us the whole time.
Yeah, the intention was definitely not to have us. Okay, so there is a link there that is the slide deck. If you can see the screen, which is visible now, let me hide that. cmp.ac/relief-teacher relief webinar 1. That is the slide deck that I've been using. And at the end of it, there's a whole bunch of resources that I've put in there. For example, the DT Hub is sort of your one-stop shop for all digital technologies. Resources. It's run by Education Services Australia, and it's a nationally funded program to look at resources that are available to you as teachers. There's some great webinars there. There's links to the CS Unplugged and the classic CS Unplugged there. There's also the CS Field Guide. CS stands for Computer Science, by the way. Sorry, I assumed information. That's a bit more like a sort of online interactive textbook, a bit more aimed at high school students. The CSER MOOC, which is the Computer Science Education Research Group at the University of Adelaide, run these online courses that you can do. They also have professional learning in a box, where you can run your own professional learning, or someone at your school can if they are a bit more cluey about that. There's a whole kit that they've created that's sort of ready to go. There's lots and lots and lots of resources.
Wow.
The Beaverus Challenge covers a bit more computational thinking activities, and I'll actually talk about the Beaverus Challenge in the next webinar. There are lots and lots and lots of resources, so please have a look at the slide deck. I've included them there just so you have a bit of a reference, as opposed to just trying to remember things that I've said. They're actually written down for you. And the URL for that is cmp.ac/relief-webinar-1.
Fantastic.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
I think because of time,
yep.
We can say, and because we can't see many other questions here.
It's visible now. So it looks like it wasn't visible for a lot of you. I think the slide deck were very kind of essential in understanding some of those things that I was talking about, because it was really more about the slide deck than me. I'll have a chat with Rebecca. Whatever happens, a version of this talk will be going on YouTube with the slides attached.
Yeah.
And so if the recording didn't pick that up, then we'll make sure that that is there for you, and we'll send that, and that will be what is going on YouTube mainly.
Yeah.
Okay.
And thanks, guys. We're really sorry about that. We'll have this mastered come part 2, but yes, obviously you will be able to access those slides, and hopefully you'll be able to pick up on any gaps that may have been there as a result of not seeing them.
And maybe because we've covered a lot. I mean, we covered 10 years of schooling in an hour, and so of this particular concept. And so there's a lot to go through, so it may be quite helpful to watch it again.
Yeah,
anyway.
Exactly. So guys, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and apologies again about the slides, but we look forward to seeing you again in part 2, which is going to be quite soon. We just are going to finalize a date for that. So thanks a lot, and thank you very much, Owen. We really appreciate you coming here and helping us with this.
Okay. Great.
Thanks a lot, everyone, and we
Thanks.
look forward to seeing you next time.
Okay, thanks guys.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.